So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first of 4 virtual Pulse meetings that PGRO and Syngenta are holding this week. My name is Rebecca Stilton. I'm one of the portfolio managers for Syngenta, and I'll be hosting the meeting this morning. Today we're going to hear from Andy Berry from Frontier. Andy is one of the pulse traders for them. And he's going to talk us through the market for UK pulses. We're then going to hear from Steve Belcher from PGRO, who's going to talk to us about varieties that are on the market and those coming forwards. Just a couple of housekeeping before we get going. To let you know, the session will be recorded. And the recordings will be shared on the Syngenta UK YouTube channel, as well as the PGRO website. And we would request that you don't record the session by any other means, because they will be available on those 2 channels mentioned there. We thoroughly encourage questions, but what we would ask is that you use the Q&A function in Zoom, as is highlighted on the slide here. You should be able to find that on the bottom of your screen. If you can type your questions in there, as part of hosting the meeting, I will facilitate those and ask them to the 2 speakers. You will receive an email after the event, which will include a link to claims and basis points, and also a link to a survey, which we'd be very grateful if you could complete. So without further ado, I will hand over to Andy Berry, who's going to talk to us about the UK market for pulses.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. This is an unusual experience for me, but we'll see if we can make it work and we can crack on with the show. So can we all see that? Is that all right, Rebecca? Can we see where we are?
That's perfect. Thanks, Andy.
Okay, so what I'd like to do today is to go through the market for UK pulses, look at the outlook, and look at the developments that are coming in the market, and some of the changes which we see coming up in the future. My name's Andy Berry. I'm the pulse trader for Frontier Agriculture, trading pulses from the UK to domestic homes, as well as to outside the UK as well. So first of all, I'd like to look at peas. This is a rather shorter part of the presentation. Peas are relatively fixed in terms of their area covering in the UK. We're looking at somewhere production-wise between 150 and 200,000 tonnes a year. And the main emphasis that I'd always say about UK grown peas is the emphasis is absolutely about colour. The price difference, as you know, if you fail to get that nice green colour of pea, is between 50 and 80 pounds a tonne for the problems of bleaching. And it is a challenge to get peas to be green, but they generally need harvesting earlier and then drying slowly, because the colour can go very quickly in August when the times come for harvesting. And really splitting the pulses into animal feed and human consumption. Animal feed domestically, we have 3 or 4 micronizing plants in the UK. Here the peas are cooked under hot tiles very quickly as they move along on metal conveyor belts, and then they're rolled into discs at the end, and then going into dried coarse feeds, rabbit feed, etc., etc. And they also go into compound feed, but it's a very small market in the UK. And again, the price difference is between 50 and 70 pounds a tonne. Human consumption for peas, continuing to see this grow. Unfortunately, we're beginning to see some of the improvement whereby instead of exporting Marrowfat peas and then re-importing them back, we are seeing some Marrowfat peas being consumed in the UK and made into snacks. And we're also seeing other companies develop snacks where the peas are puffed up into a bit like a what's it, and there's a large company manufacturing those in the northwest. Peas are also used traditionally for soups and thickeners, and that again, looking for colour, because from the shelf point of view, it's about the visual appearance. And of course, then there's still the mushy and the tin peas. I think the main point is that with growing peas, it is about colour. It's about not trying to look at a feed pea, because the competition is so great from Eastern Europe particularly, and the big international producers. We need to specialise, and definitely would recommend that growers look to get contracts rather than grow them on the open market. So moving on from peas, I'm going to spend quite a bit more time talking about beans. Sometimes they're called Faba beans, sometimes they're called Fava beans, but internationally they're generally referred to as Faba. And this slide is really quite important in as much as it demonstrates how critical the UK is and how big the UK is in world feed bean or human consumption bean production. The numbers slightly distorted there in 2020. We think that the UK crop is probably nearer 500,000, but the biggest and dominating crop is by far the Australian crop this year, which is probably in excess of 500,000. And that is the main competing product for our beans, which would go into Egypt and the Middle East. And from the demand point of view, this demonstrates with the blue columns how significant that Egypt is as the major consumer of Faba beans internationally. And the beans here are used either to be cooked whole or split, but the significance is that this is the leading market, and if we're unable to supply because of the relatively cheap supply of Australian beans, then it absolutely knocks our exports on the head. And the other interesting point to note, and this is back in 2019, is the orange bars, which are aquaculture, and particularly into Norway, which where beans are used for salmon production. And we can see that rising number 38 from 2015 up to 137 in 18, and then a sharp decline. And that's really and only because the price difference between beans and wheat was basically got too narrow, and so the salmon consumers use wheat as the binder instead of beans, but a little bit more of that in a while. So that's the international market, and it's a very small market with only a few countries really partaking. In the UK, we split the market into feed and human consumption, and the feed is then broken down again into animal feed and aquaculture. So traditionally, beans have been used in the ruminant feed mills, particularly in the north and west of the country, and in the south and west as well. But again, if the bean prices are relatively high compared to other raw materials, then the consumers will continue just to use their traditional mid-range proteins of a rapeseed meal blended with wheat. There's a large market for the extruding plants. Extruding plants are where beans are actually blended together with on a 50-50 with rapeseed, and then extruded, pushed through at high pressure to make a meal, which goes into the poultry industry. And that's an important part of our domestic consumption in the UK. And then dehulled feed beans, where we actually remove the outer layer of the bean, the skin, and this removes the fibre, helping the protein. And this is a big and growing demand into aquaculture and also into pet foods. And then the last important bracket is human consumption. And human consumption can be basically split into two, splitting for falafel, where the outside layers are taken off again, where they're and then used and ground up and deep fried as a snack, They're also consumed whole as we would baked beans, and then mixed with herbs and spices, and to produce a nutritious, healthy breakfast. But we're also seeing the growth of snacks in the UK, and these are readily available in UK supermarkets. There's a couple of home companies who make them, Hodmadods down in Suffolk. I would strongly recommend you to try some of their dried bean and pea products. It's an excellent product. So that's the overall market. And where do these beans go to? And just to put some perspective on the numbers, and these change regularly every year. The Dehulling beans, we're looking at somewhere in the region of around 40,000 tons of Dehulling beans either being exported to Scotland, by truck to Scotland, or exported over to Norway. And this is lifting up, particularly as we've seen feed beans this year sort of left behind a little bit from the wheat market, and therefore it's making them far more competitive in the ration. Egypt this year, as we've said, is a very big crop from Australia. So unfortunately, the exports to Egypt are very, very limited this year. In total, no more than 50,000 tons, and that may even be less than that. To my knowledge, there's only one bulk vessel travel there and a number of containers, but it's pretty limited. And the other market, again limited, is into Sudan, which are all in bags. And so because we haven't had the quality, we've seen a big increase in feed exports to the EU. Then on the left-hand side, the compound feed dotted around the country and fed on farm as well, between 50 and 100,000 tons. And the extruders I was referring to before, where they're blended with, the beans are blended with whole rapeseed, cooked and extruded, there's between 50 and 100,000 tons. There are a number of those other plants now beginning to appear actually in compound feed mills. So we've got a market dominated by export, with a relatively small volume consumed domestically. So the prices are always going to reflect the export market at any one time. One of the major notable points was the reduction of demand of human consumption beans. And these charts are information that we've put together from Frontier in conjunction with the PGRO to basically plot the movement of the Bruchid infestation. The color isn't too expressive on these charts, but basically the very dark colors are where there's very low or little Bruchid infestation. It's a rather small slide, so between 1 to 2%, with yellow greens being the higher numbers and unsuitable for Bruchid. And what we've seen is in 2010, really not too many issues, and plenty of good quality Bruchid in East Anglia, here in the West Midlands, and plenty up in Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and certainly up in the Scottish borders. But now 2015, we've started to see more of the lighter colours appearing, as we've seen the Bruchid beetle move from south to north. And this is something almost to be expected, because unfortunately the same situation has happened in France, and France used to be a major supplier of human consumption beans to Egypt, where now there are zero exports of beans because the Bruchid infestation in Egypt is far too high. But if we zoom forward to 2020, we can see here quite dramatically the number of sites with the dark blue colours are very few and far between in the south. And it's really only once you get to North Lincolnshire and north of the Humber that we begin to see the Bruchid levels low enough to be achievable for human consumption. Now, Bruchid isn't the be-all and end-all. The main criteria that our customers are looking for is colour, and they've got to be light and bright. And it is difficult for farmers and growers to influence colour. harvesting them early, but that can only be done if desiccation is done in good time. So there is a challenge there. But certainly our concerns are that if this pattern continues, and I'm afraid it probably will, we will see a reducing market for human consumption. But that does mean that we need to just concentrate more on the feed elements of these markets here. So what are the customers looking for? These are whole beans and dehulled or split beans on the left. So this is the perfect type of bean that our customers are looking for, a nice light color with a slight greenish hue. This would be for human consumption. And then on the right, dehulled or split beans, ideally with no darkness, no holes, and no bruchid activity, and no skin attached. When we're dehulling for aquaculture, there is an element of a little bit of the husk and shell still left there, but certainly from a human consumption point of view, the customers are looking for a very clean, and this job is principally done in the countries in question with very sophisticated plants now. So that's what our buyers are looking for. And when farmers and growers say to me, well, are they human consumption? I often say, well, have a look at them. You know, would you eat them? The answer may be no, but if you put that alongside a very dark sample with a lot of staining and bruchid beetle, it's very easy to make the decision as to which one you'd use. So we talked a lot about dehulling. Frontier have a pelleting plant and a dehulling plant, which has a capacity of 50,000 tons of consumption. So it's a big facility, and it's right in the middle of the country, so ideally placed from the feed point of view as demand. And basically the plant is taking the whole bean, putting them through these dehullers here, which are probably the best way to describe them, are like the old-fashioned tub washing machines that they're rotating round, and the beans are dropping down through, and the skin has been removed as it's rubbed against something akin to a combine concave, which is actually knocking the outside shell off. And so we're ending up with hopefully a nice clean dehulled bean, and then the skins which are then used. And here we convert these into animal feed by pressing them together to make a pellet by blending them with rapeseed meal. And just a couple of slides just to give you an indication of how things are changing. And from an aquaculture point of view, it's a significant market. The total volume demanded by fish food, with all its environmental issues that are going on at the moment, but it's a growing industry. Currently, in excess of 1.3 million tons of salmon feed is used between Scotland and Norway. And these were the traditional type of pens in fjords, but with all the problems that brings with it, having enclosed waters in either locks or fjords. But just, I've shown this slide before, it just shows that the movement on that, how these companies now are moving the feed very efficiently from large vessels. These are 3,000 ton vessels with the arm moving across automatically and dropping the feed into the hopper. This is on an inland, rather locks and inland waters. But the movement is certainly to these much larger pens, which can be moored offshore, can contain up to 4,000 tons of salmon in each of these. And obviously this is a great way of avoiding some of the environmental problems of sea lice by having these pens away out at sea, where there's plenty of water movement and there's less opportunity to infect local and domestic salmon, local and wild salmon. So that just gives you a nature and a size and a scale of this industry, which we see as continuing and moving on. So where is the outlook for the market? We actually see strong demand for both peas and beans. With the current change in the political system in the UK in terms of subsidising and supporting agriculture, we're all aware of the challenges ahead, and we can only push, and we are through Pulses UK, trying to put pressure on the government where we can to support a strong pulse industry for all the reasons which most of you will be very well aware. Despite the pressures of human consumption, the demand for feed beans is still strong. And I think growing beans in the south with an eye on Bruchid, there is a point at which spraying for Bruchid is probably not a worthwhile exercise, particularly when we have these periods of hot, dry weather, when the pods are small at the bottom of the plant and the activity of the Bruchid beetle is very high. And you can get that information from Pulses, from the PGRO through their Bruchid cast. And then we're also seeing more, I'm getting asked a lot of time about new uses for pulses, both for food and for feed. More inquiries. People are looking for, or businesses are looking for more domestically grown and European grown protein and removing the reliance from imported soybean. And we're also seeing a number of successful operations looking to use pulses to make textured vegetable protein for meat substitutes, and I think that is definitely something which is on the move at the moment. And we've even had one inquiry, and a test case has actually been done, and trials have been done in using the part of the beans to make single-use plastics, which are completely biodegradable. So there are a lot of interesting, exciting, slightly slow-moving, but there are good opportunities for both peas and beans for growers in the UK. So I think I've probably gone over my time, so I will hand back to Rebecca. If I stop share, that should work.
That's okay, Andy. Thank you very much.
That worked.
That was really interesting from my perspective. Actually, I was listening quite intently to the Bruchid part of your discussion. So obviously, part of my portfolio is insecticide, so that's quite interesting to see the increase there, and with the also the increasing resistance with traditional chemistry. It makes life interesting for growers to try and control. So we've got a couple of questions here that have come in that we'll tick off quickly before we move on to Steve. So the first is, any preference for winter or spring beans in terms of the markets? No preference. A winter and a spring bean. The buyers for human consumption will buy winter beans. Traditionally, they would have bought the wizard beans, which were large and the good colour. Tundra as a variety is a very good variety, but it does tend to have a slightly smudgy surface look to it, so it does put off some customers. But from a feed point of view, absolutely no difference whatsoever, and from a starch and protein extraction, absolutely no difference at all. Perfect. Another, which country do you feel offers best long-term market for beans?
I still think that from Egypt's point of view, the demand is going to be there. The demand for pulses is always going to be there. And whilst I've been a little bit negative this year because of the Australian impact, UK beans have a very high profile and a far quicker cooking time than Aussie beans. So that would certainly be for a human consumption, and for feed, I absolutely think that it's a continuation into Norway and Scotland, obviously same country, but I think that's where our long-term hopes continue to lie. Okay, just two more quick questions. Rotationally, should pulses always be 1 in 5 minimum, and do cover crops with legumes represent an issue? You still there, Andy?
Oh, do you want me to pick up on that one afterwards, Rebecca?
It might be my connection.
Yep. Perfect. Okay, well, we'll save the rest of the questions until the end of the presentation, and we'll now hand over to Steve to talk to us about varieties. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Andy. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the meeting. Andy has already talked through some of the markets available for pulses. It's my job now to go through all of this and put some varieties to all of that as well. So I'm going to talk to you about peas, spring beans and winter beans. And my slides appear to have frozen up. Here we go. But before I do that, I'd like to first talk through some of the changes that have occurred to what was the recommended list and is now a descriptive list. For some people, descriptive lists are not rated as highly as a recommended list, nor they perceive them as prestigious as a descriptive list. But I'd like to assure you that as far as the descriptive list now goes, there's been no change to the data that we've used. It would have been the same data had we called it a recommended list as a descriptive list. There's been no change either to the rigor or the quality of the data that we've used to produce those. And indeed, the number of sites we've used hasn't changed. That remains as it was, and I'll show you the sites and their locations shortly. As far as table goes, there are some cosmetic changes to the tables with 1 or 2 new additions to categories as well. In terms of categorizing the recommendations, in the past we would have had a full recommendation, a P1 and a P2 provisional recommendations. We don't now use those. What we have is either a 5, 4 or a 3-year status on the descriptive list. You cannot get more than a 5-year status because we use a 5-year rolling data set. But of course, alongside of that, we do list the year that the variety was first introduced to the list. So it gives you an idea of newer varieties coming onto the list and how long they've been around, or indeed varieties that have been around for many years, and longevity of those varieties. And indeed, being on the list for quite some time may give you an idea of how robust those varieties are. We have changed the yield controls as well. More recently, we've used 2 yield controls per crop. In the past, it has been up to 4, but more recently 2. And that has caused us 1 or 2 issues in recent years as well, particularly where ones have failed or not performed as they should have done. So what we now use for yield controls is a wide basket of varieties, all of those varieties that appear either in year 4 or year 5 status on the list. And they contribute to the 100% yield control. And I think what that will give us is that certainly over years, it will give us a more robust yield control, and indeed on a yearly basis as well. Straw length, as far as straw length goes, I think this is a change that's been a long time coming. Varieties used to be listed on a 1 to 9 scale, where 9 was short and 1 is long. And while that gave you an indication of how long or short a particular variety was in comparison to others, you never actually got an idea of how tall things grew. So we now list them as we measure them in centimetres, and you know exactly how tall something is and the relative difference between them. There's also been changes to the categorisation of the pea types. Andy's already mentioned that internationally, peas are traded either as yellow peas or round green peas. So what we've now done is to call what we call the white peas. These are now yellow stroke white peas, and the large blue peas, we've now called those green peas, and then they're categorized as green stroke large blue. But what we've also done as well is to incorporate the small blue category into the green peas. There has been some confusion in recent years about the small blue size, and indeed we've had the small blue, which has been bigger than some large blues, and some large blues that have been smaller than the small blue. So to avoid that confusion, they're just now lumped into one category. But of course, alongside, we do list the 1,000 grain weight, and you're able to get an indication of the size of a particular variety from that. But of course, we haven't done this just for the sake of doing it. One of the reasons we have done this is for flexibility. Flexibility in giving you the choice of varieties which to grow, the ability to perhaps serve niche markets, the ability to add new categories and new traits or new characters to this descriptive list. My mind, when we started all this, my mind wandered back to many years ago when we had a particular seed company that came to us with 2 varieties of peas which had a novel seed characteristic. They were put to us for recommended list evaluation, and we said, well, where's the market for these peas? They said, well, there isn't currently one, but if you put them onto the recommended list, the market will develop. They had this particular novel trait that when fed to laying chickens, the egg yolks became a brighter yellow. It was a tentative piece of work that was done anyway. They were low yielding, and of course they didn't get anywhere near the recommended list at the time. But I think if we were considering those today in 2021, we may consider them in a different light, particularly in terms of niche markets. So I mentioned the numbers of sites that because we have to produce data, and the data comes from sites that are located across the UK, 6 winter bean locations, 10 spring beans and 7 peas. The spring beans have the widest distribution and pea trials the narrowest distribution. So Andy's talked about the markets and some of the requirements for those markets. One thing he didn't mention in his talk, but he's told me on numerous occasions, is that size matters, and often bigger the better. And I'll highlight some of those as I go through the varieties. But of course, there are other characters that growers need to consider as well, not just growing for the particular market, that's really important, but also characters that are suitable for growing, such as disease resistance. There's also perhaps other markets as well that you should consider, that is growing for your own use if you have chickens or pigs, concentrating that buying, selling chain down and using on your own farm, or growing for seed contracts, in fact, because many of those year 3 and year 4 varieties won't be generally available. They'll only be available on seed contracts. And of course, there's vining peas as well that you could consider for growing as a seed crop. For variety choice, there's lots of aspects that you should consider. There's lots of data that are presented on this descriptive list that you could make use of, but there's perhaps more subjective areas as well. Do you use a local merchant or do you use a national merchant? But what does that merchant offer you? What do you offer you in terms of relationships? Do you have a good relationship with your merchant? And how well do they look after you? Not just in terms of buying peas and beans, but other crops as well and other inputs. What are their contract terms? And indeed, if you fail to meet the quality criteria, what can they offer you in terms of other areas for the peas or beans to be sold into? So what we're looking at now is the descriptive list on winter beans. And the variety wizard, it's been on the list since 2003. And for many years, for the export market, beans are asked for by name, by the wizard name. Not perhaps quite so true now, because Tundra has come along since, and it's sort of surpassed wizard, perhaps in terms of area. Newer varieties have now come along, such as Bumble and Vespa, which are proving to be quite popular as well. But 2 new varieties, Norton and Vincent, due to the list for 2021. And I'll just point out Vincent, it has a really quite a massive 1,000 seed weight, 849 grams. And for the splitting market, that makes a big difference. And where they're taking the hulls off as well, that makes a difference also. Final variety is honey at the bottom, relatively low yields, but it does have early maturity, short variety that's suitable for growing in the north and running up into the borders and Scotland as well. The important point is that they're all pale hilum, so they should be all suitable for the export markets. Moving on to spring beans, you'll see that there's an awful lot of them now. The list has expanded quite a bit over recent years, and there's quite a number of varieties now that have come new to the list for 2021 in the year 3 status. Number of varieties in 4 years and indeed 5 years as well. And you'll note again that all of them are pale hilum, with the exception of Maris bead at the bottom. And these 4 here, in addition to being pale hilum, are low vicing, convicing types as well, which makes them perhaps more suitable when used in rations for feeding to monogastrics and in particular to poultry as well. As a summary of all of that, and all the data is there available for download from the PGRO website. New to the list for 2021 is a very high yielding variety called Stella. On a par is LG Viper, which again is new to the list. But the highest yielding year 5 variety is Variety Lynx, and you'll note it has a very high rating for downy mildew as well, with a rating of 8. Also with a rating of 8 is variety Yukon. While on paper, Yukon looks to be rather low yielding compared to the rest, it does have particularly early maturity. It's by far and away the earliest spring bean we have, and it will find favour, I think, particularly growing in the north, growing into the borders and perhaps into Scotland as well. It does show a very bright colour as well. Perhaps doesn't have quite the greeny tinge that Andy was talking about, but the colour and the brightness of the bean really stands out compared to some of the rest. In terms of size, and size matters for the splitting and dehulling market, macho in the spring beans consistently comes out as one of the largest seeded beans. I've already mentioned the earliness of Yukon, but protein as well is particularly important, and the higher concentration of protein, particularly for the aquaculture market, is important. LG Cartouche consistently shows to be the higher protein of just over 29%, but there's an awful lot of varieties now that are in the 28%, between 28 and 29% in terms of percentage protein. We've got the pale hilum and low vicing, convicing varieties of Victus, Bolivia, Allison and Tiffany, all yielding pretty much alike and just below that of the best. And the final variety is Maris bead, which on paper looks particularly low yielding, but it is the only variety of its type. It's a small round tick bean specifically used in the pigeon feed market. So moving on to peas, and then we now have yellow stroke white peas. Not too many of these, and there is a limited market for them rather than the green peas. But these do have an exceptional yield potential, particularly chameleon at 120%, 115% for orchestra, came at 112%, and the highest yielding year 5 variety is Carpate at 111%. In terms of downy mildew, average to just better than average, orchestra a little bit lower, and chameleon with an average rating of 5. A lot of what we would have called large blues, which are now called green stroke blue peas, an awful lot of them. And of course, we've included greenwood in this category now, the small blue, which you can see from the 1,000 seed weight is quite a bit smaller than anything else on the list at 225 grams. Highest yielding of these green seeded peas is the variety Cactus at 112%, Blue Time 111, Stroma 111, Greenway 109. If you remember back to the white seeded peas, we were looking at a maximum yield here of about 120%. Some good ratings for downy mildew here, and I'll pick up on that within the next slide. New category that we've added also for 2021 is this powdery mildew rating here as well. The final slide for peas, I've lumped two categories together here, the maple peas, which are Mantara and Rose, both of which have been around for a number of years, particularly Rose since 2003. They have their own particular markets, and they are quite lucrative markets as well, albeit rather small. The reason these only have a 3-year rating in the matrix is that they went into limited trialling a couple of years ago, so they've skipped a couple of years and will come back for 2021 trialling. The final category, the Marrowfat category, Sakura dominates this particular market in terms of yield, in terms of area grown, and there is another variety, Kabuki, which is grown on contract to ADM, takes a significant share also. And the final variety will be Marrow, where smaller areas have been grown also. On paper, Akuma, a new variety here, looks to be really good in terms of yield, 11% higher yielding than Sakura, one point just ahead in terms of downy mildew at a rating of 5, and with a very high 1,000 seed weight of 405 grams. So on paper, it looks quite a good variety. But what will make or break these Marrowfats of Akuma, Octavia and Banshee is what the processors make of them, particularly in terms of processing, in terms of water soaking, how well they take water, how they go through the canning process, how they appear in terms of appearance for these packet markets, and indeed for the coatings markets as well. So as a summary of all of the peas, you can see that the very high yielding white peas in Chameleon. In terms of size, Orchestra as a yellow pea stands out. In the green seeded ones, there are two varieties in terms of size. One is Stroma and the other one is Greenwich, particularly large seeded. And the new category that we've added this year, powdery mildew, we have 3 varieties there to have proven to have really high tolerance. Powdery mildew has come to the fore over recent years. It's a late season disease, and it's perhaps in part because of the later sowings, maybe because of the restrictions that have been put onto the use of Wackel XL by not being able to plant pre-April the 1st. But it was a particular problem in 2020, and a lot of this data has come from some of our own observations, but also from the breeders, and Blue Man in particular has showing really high tolerance, LG Aviator showing really high tolerance. Greenwood we've rated alongside of those, but in my opinion, the resistance rating is not quite as good as either Blue Man or LG Aviator, but neither is it intermediate resistant. It's kind of somewhere between. Already mentioned the size of Akuma, particularly large seeded Marrowfat. But what struck me when I put this graph together was the downy mildew ratings, which are the black circles. Our usual recommendation is that where you've had a rating of 5 or less, then you will perhaps use a seed treatment to control downy mildew, such as Wackel XL. But where you had 6 or more, if you really hadn't had much of a history of growing peas or no history of downy mildew in the past, then you perhaps wouldn't need to use a seed treatment for downy mildew control. And you can see there from 6 onwards, there's an awful lot of varieties now with 6, quite a few with 7, and then we've got a standout variety, which again is Blue Man, with a rating of 8, where it's quite a robust rating that as well. That's all I have to say for today. You can visit the website to download the descriptive list. Also, you'll see a couple of email addresses there for the Bean Yen and the P Yen, the Yield Enhancement Network for peas, and these will continue into 2021. And if anyone is interested in joining us to help us to learn how to grow pulse crops better, then please get in contact via the email addresses listed there. And the final slide, therefore, is are there any questions?
That's great. Thanks, Steve. So a couple of outstanding questions that we've got come through, and please, if you've got any further ones, type them into the Q&A box. But rotationally, should pulses always be 1 in 5 minimum, and do cover crops with legumes represent an issue?
Yeah, it should be a 1 in 5 rotation as a minimum, and the longer the better. Finding pea growers are often on way more than 5, 1 in 8, 1 in 10, and some even longer than that. If you're trying to get around a particular rotation problem, then growing 1 in 1, 1 in 2 as an ad hoc can be done also, but then drop back into the minimum of a 1 in 5 after that. Yeah. What was the other question, Rebecca? Remind me. It was pulses, wasn't it?
Do cover crops?
Yes.
Legumes represent an issue.
Yeah. Well, you don't need to, if you're sowing a cover crop prior to peas or beans, certainly don't include peas and beans within the cover cropping. My colleague Leah Herald has done quite a bit of work in finding peas on cover crops. She's found no issues with vetch, for example, and perhaps some of the clovers as well. In fact, she has found some benefits from using vetch.
Brilliant, thank you. Becky has answered this question, but I'll give the question and the answer because I think people might find it interesting and useful to know. So it was asked if there'd been any work done on companion cropping in spring beans to help control Bruchid beetle, to which Becky responded that PGRO have started a 3-year programme this year to investigate whether companion cropping can help with Bruchid and weevil management. The data at the minute is limited because it's in the first year. It does indicate some potential, so that's something to watch this space on going forwards, to see what transpires from the work that you're doing. So I think we've covered, just checking all of the questions. So just to finish off, just to say thank you very much to Andy and Steve for their presentations. Thank you very much to all of you on the webinar for joining us. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is first of 4, so there's 3 more this week. Short little webinars from Syngenta and PGRO. You will receive an email further to the webinar finishing to follow up with your to claim your basis points, and also a link to a survey, which we'd be very grateful that if you could complete that. And the recording of this webinar will be available on both our Syngenta YouTube channel and the PGRO website shortly. So thanks once again, and hope to see you at the rest of the webinars.